Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am happy to see all of you. A lot going on in the world these days for us to discuss. So glad that we have the time to be here. Good evening to everyone. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Let's do it again.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. Wow, a lot to talk about, but hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notifications bell. Right now, we are live here on YouTube. We are live on Rumble. We are live on Rockfin. We are live on all three platforms, and we are marching ahead. If you would like me to talk about a certain topic, you have a question, you have a comment, you got something you want me to react to, send a super chat here on YouTube. Send a Rumble rant on Rockfin, or send a Rockfin tip on Rockfin. Send a Rumble rant on the Rumble. Wherever you're watching, make sure that you let us know what it is you want us to talk about. The way this works, I give my opening remarks. That's just what I want to talk about. Then from there, we do the roll call, where we find out who is on the other side of the camera, names and locations. It's always very, very exciting to find out who our audience is, etc. Then from there, I answer your super chat questions or your Rumble rant questions or your Rockfin tip questions for the rest of the night. That's the way it works. So start thinking of good super chat, Rumble rant, Rockfin tip questions. Get your questions ready. I'll be noting them as I do my opening remarks. Looking forward to the second half of the show, which is all me answering your questions. Now, just a couple quick announcements before we get going here. The organization that I am dedicated to, Center for Political Innovation. And we at the Center for Political Innovation are having a national education workshop in Vermont. And it's coming up April 26th through the 29th. And it's going to be awesome. 4 days of anti-imperialist socialist education. And we would love for you to be there. If you're a member of the CPI, come out and participate in CPI activities, be involved in the planning, etc. If you are someone who is a friend or ally of the CPI, come and join with us and have fun. If you're a new person and you want to learn what it's all about, come as well. Everyone who's coming needs to go ahead and register. The link is down below. I'm dropping the link in the chat. I'm dropping it on Rockfin. I'm dropping it on Rumble. We would love to have you there. It's going to be a very, very important educational event. So please, if you are at all interested in these kinds of politics and you want to meet people from our community, people who have this perspective, I would encourage you to register for our upcoming retreat. Once you register, members of our leadership team in CPI will call you up and get to engage with you and find out what you're about. And we look to have a great weekend with our friends and allies and with some new people in Vermont. It's going to be a great national educational weekend retreat, out of the movement to the masses, April 26th through the 29th. It's going to be great. So go ahead and register. That is what we would like you to do. All right, folks. So as I said before, the way this works is I give my opening remarks. Then we do the roll call. We find out who's on the other side of the camera, who's watching. Then from there, I answer your questions for the rest of the night. So get your questions ready for the second half of the show. And I will get into my opening remarks for tonight. But first, I will take a drink of water. Got my spring allergies. It's springtime here in New York City. But I am still horrified and in shock about the horrendous shooting at the Crocus concert hall in Moscow. Having just been in Moscow a few days prior to that, I'm still horrified and shocked by that event. Still trying to process the details of how this happened, but this is what we know. We know that on March 7th, the U.S. State Department issued a travel advisory saying that they anticipated extremists in Russia attacking concert halls. And we know that it then happened. And so the U.S. government announced to the world that they had some kind of knowledge of this attack and that it was coming. And furthermore, we also know that the individuals who've been apprehended were trying to flee to the Ukrainian border, where there were Ukrainian government personnel that were ready to help them once they got to the border. We also know that all over social media, Ukrainian sympathizers and Ukrainian supporters are celebrating the attack. They think it was a great thing. They're happy to see all kinds of Russian young people dead. We also know that the individuals who were involved, who were apprehended by the Russian security services, turns out they were recruited on the internet. They were listening to Muslim preachers, and they were contacted by people on Telegram who offered them money and told them that they would be protected, and that this fits a pattern of sabotage in Russia. Just in a similar manner, someone was approached and offered money to pour ink on ballots during the election. That someone was offered money and given a statue that actually had a bomb in it to blow up and kill a Russian journalist. That this is how the Ukrainian intelligence services have been operating. Furthermore, we know that the Ukrainian intelligence services and the Ukrainian government is basically at this point on life support. It barely has any of its own feet to stand on at this point. It's almost completely a front for NATO countries and their intelligence services. The New York Times revealed about how the CIA was operating out of certain hotels in Ukraine. It was training different armed factions and providing them with names of people to assassinate and kill, and teaching them how to engage in assassinations and guerrilla warfare in Ukraine. We know that the CIA has been all over Ukraine and was preparing for the war for many years. The Minsk agreement escalate tension in Ukraine, we now understand, was simply a ploy to set the stage for an eventual fight with Russia. They had no intention of ever honoring the Minsk agreement. And all of this points to the involvement of the Ukrainian intelligence agencies in carrying out this horrendous attack. And it also points to the indirect involvement of the American intelligence agencies. Now, of course, we can't prove this. There's no smoking gun. But the fact that the American government knew that the attack was going to happen and announced that to the world, the fact that there were Ukrainian forces planning to meet them at the border, the fact that there has been knowledge that the way these men were recruited was through the internet, the same way the Ukrainian intelligence services have been recruiting people to murder people and bomb people in Russia. It fits the pattern. All of this seems to indicate that the American government was indirectly involved, that the Ukrainian government was directly involved, and that this was a case of CIA-linked terrorism. Now, we don't know for sure, but based on what we do know, we can connect the dots and infer this kind of thing. And that's the way intelligence-related matters generally are. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Wag the Dog, but in the movie Wag the Dog, which is a classic movie from the 90s, they make the analogy of the CIA and intelligence agencies being like producers in television. This is a very interesting analogy. The producer on television, in a television production, in a movie or in a TV show, the producer, what do? Well, they don't think of it. They don't write the screenplay. They don't make the decisions. They're not the director. They don't appear on screen. They're not the actor. They don't film it. They're not the cameraman. The producer just kind of makes sure that everyone's where they need to be. The director and others come together. They say, we want to make this movie. So they make sure the camera guy is here. They make sure that the actor is here. They make sure the director's decisions are carried out. They coordinate with, and they just kind of make things happen. And if the producer does their job well, no one knows that they're there. Things just happen. The director says action, the cameraman films, the actor acts, the scripts are available on time from the writer. And if the producer is doing their job well enough, no one knows that they exist. But if something goes wrong on the movie set, if for some reason the camera doesn't work, if for some reason the actor doesn't show up, if the director is unsatisfied with the final product, who does everyone blame? The producer. And this analogy is made in the movie Wag the Dog, and it's very applicable. That is what intelligence agencies are. They do very little themselves. And they don't make the decisions themselves. They don't decide what to do. And their job is to just kind of lurk in the background, be semi-invisible, and make things happen. And they don't do the things that happen. They find other people to do them. And they don't think of what to do. They've got somebody else to tell them what to do. And if they do their job right, no one knows that they exist. But when things go wrong, everyone realizes that they exist. And this is the nature of the intelligence world. Bill Moyers, the PBS filmmaker, he has a great little documentary that talks about some of the CIA's activities over the years. It's called The Shadow Government, or The Invisible Government, something like that. Because if you look at what the CIA is and the way that they've operated, that's very much what they are. They are a government that doesn't exist. They are a network of power that officially does not exist. And this is when people talk about the deep state. You know, I've been talking about the deep state for years. I first heard the term deep state during the 2011 Arab Spring, the Egyptian revolution. And the term deep state was used in the Middle East to describe how in many Middle Eastern countries, Egypt included, Israel, Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the invisible intelligence forces that are very much a representative of the government are everywhere and are a big part of people's lives. They are the unknown state. They are the invisible state. And that's what the term deep state refers to. Now in the United States, since the era of Trump, we talk about deep state. And Trumpers generally, when they mean deep state, they're referring to layers of corporations and others that are tied in with the government. They're referring to something a little bit different. They mean like the military industrial complex. They mean private contractors that are contracted by the government. They mean government employees and stuff. They're referring to something a little bit different. But the way when I first heard the term deep state, and when people specifically associated the term deep state with the Middle East, they were referring to the fact that in that region of the world, right? If anyone's ever been to Israel, they'll know that Mossad is all over Israel. It's everywhere, and it's nowhere, right? No one acknowledges that it exists, but it's everywhere, right? Anyone who lived in Egypt, maybe even today, if you live in Egypt now, you'll know that the Egyptian secret police, the Egyptian military are everywhere, but their presence is not acknowledged. It refers to this layer of government, that is everywhere, that has a lot of power, but officially doesn't exist. That's what the term deep state refers to. And that is generally, when we talk about intelligence agencies, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the secret government or the shadow government. And, I'm just going to do a quick review. For some of you who are familiar with this kind of anti-imperialist politics, this might seem like, duh, yeah, Caleb, we already know about this. But let's just review this, because when the U.S. government launched its war on terror in 2001, anybody who knew anything about the history of the United States had to laugh, because the American government has been one of the main sponsors of terrorism around the world for years and years to come. Let's quickly talk, before we get into the history of the American government and American intelligence and terrorism, let's just quickly talk about the word terrorism, because it's important to understand the origin of the word. The word terrorism has kind of evolved over time. The origin of the term referred to the French Revolution. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, there was a period they called the Reign of Terror, or the Terror. And this was a time when, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the more radical faction in the French Revolution, that was called the Jacobins, wanted to purge society of all of the remnants of feudalism. And they did this with mass executions. They executed people for having noble titles. They executed the king. They executed the queen. They executed the dukes and the duchesses and the marquises and others. And they wanted to exterminate the aristocracy. And they also wanted to exterminate people within French society who were not sympathetic to the revolution, people that were deemed to be what they called enemies of the people. And so they had the Committee on Public Safety, which was this body that went around society looking for enemies of the people, and they would then publicly execute them at the guillotine. And the Reign of Terror was a pretty awful time. They were trying to purge society violently of anyone who opposed the ideals of the French Revolution. One of their targets was the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church had propped up feudalism. They abolished the Catholic Church, and they promoted what they called the cult of the supreme being. They created temples of reason. They converted the churches to being temples of reason, where they were supposed to be studying science rather than religion. A lot of priests and nuns were executed. They also executed rival factions in the revolution that they claimed were not working for the revolution. And so terror originally referred to violence by revolutionaries, violence by people that were trying to achieve democratic ideals, right? Terror. And that's the origin of the term. And it didn't refer to people that went out and did left adventurism. It referred to the Jacobins, who were in power and were trying to impose their revolutionary vision on society. They were trying to impose it onto society with violence. Now, the term terrorism gains a new meaning in Russia in the 1800s. And this is very interesting. So in Russia, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you have you have the czarist government that is very autocratic, right? You have a hereditary monarchy, the czar. The czar is not only the king, but he's also the head of the church. He's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And you have many intellectuals in Russia, from the middle class, children of aristocrats, children of the emerging capitalist class, students, university people who don't like the czar. And they want to get rid of the czarist. They call it the czarist autocracy, and they want to overthrow it. And the first group that emerges are called the cadets, or the constitutional Democrats. And the constitutional Democrats, they want to create a democratic republic, a liberal democratic republic, like France or Britain or Germany. That's the first group, the cadets. Well, the cadets, they want to create a republic, but there's not much support for them among the population. And in fact, the main grievance of people among the population is economic. People are yes, they want their freedom, yes, they want their civil liberties, but more than that, they want jobs and education, and they want their living standards to go up. And the peasantry in particular wants land. So after the cadets, that movement didn't really take off. You had the rise of what were called the Narodniks. And if there's any Russian speakers here, I'm probably butchering this pronunciation, but the Narodniks, or the peopleists. Some people translate Narodniks to mean populists, but it's not the same. In English, we have an understanding of the word populism to refer to something different. But this was a specific political movement that were called Narodniks, or peopleists, or friends of the people. And they wanted to organize the peasantry of Russia to fight against the landowners and to create some kind of agrarian, rural, socialist society. They wanted to redistribute the land to the peasants. Now, there were very few peasants that were involved in this movement. It tended to be very wealthy urban students who wanted to overthrow the czar, but they realized that in order to overthrow the czar, they needed to mobilize the peasants to do it. And they were interested in socialism or whatever. So you had these very wealthy young Russians who were from very wealthy backgrounds. They would go to rural villages. They would dress in the clothes that poor people wore. They would change the way they spoke to use the language that poor people used. And they would try to recruit poor peasants to join their revolutionary movement. And they were not very successful. Generally, the peasants thought they were kind of weird. They thought these people were, condescending. They thought they were LARPing. They didn't appreciate them. The peasantry largely did not respond to the Narodniks. The Narodniks were not very successful. So out of the Narodniks, after they were not having success, all these young, wealthy Russian students who wanted to make a revolution went to the countryside and pretended to be peasants and tried to stir up the peasants to revolt, and the peasants didn't want to hear it. You had another movement that emerged, and this movement was called the terrorists. And that was not a slur on them. That's what they called themselves. They were the terrorists because their strategy for creating a revolution in Russia was to engage in acts of violence, bombings, assassinations, destruction of monuments, destruction of government buildings, robberies. They hoped that by committing very large, very visible acts of violence, that the population would see their act of terror, their act of violence, and they would see it and they would be inspired to rebel. And the terrorists, they killed Tsar Alexander III. I believe they threw bombs at his carriage and they killed him. They blew up a number of buildings throughout Russia. They destroyed monuments. They robbed banks. They kidnapped people for ransom. They did some pretty nasty acts of violence. And one of the people that was a terrorist was Vladimir Lenin's older brother. Vladimir Lenin's older brother joined the terrorists, and he engaged in an attempt to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. He failed, and so he was given the death penalty. He was hung for having tried to assassinate the Tsar. And the terrorists, they were following the strategy that if they engaged in violence, they would commit an act of violence, they would blow up a building, they would kill some elected official or whatever. And their hope was that people would see this, the peasants would see this, the factory workers would see this, and they would be outraged that this had happened, or they would be inspired that this had happened, not outraged, and they would rise up and revolt. But of course, that didn't happen. In fact, when the terrorists committed their acts of terrorism, the result tended to be working class people and the peasantry turning away from the revolutionary movement because they didn't want to get arrested. And it also tended to justify a clampdown on revolutionary activists by the government. A lot of revolutionaries would get arrested, even if they had nothing to do with the act of terrorism. So the terrorist movement, and Lenin talks about terrorism in his book, What Is to Be Done. The terrorist movement largely failed to achieve its aims. The acts of left adventurism or terrorism that they engaged in, the assassinations, the bombings, etc., they tended to have the opposite effect. They tended to weaken the revolutionary movement, to isolate the revolutionaries from the masses, to enable the government to persecute revolutionaries. And all kinds of revolutionary leaders said that terrorism was an ineffective strategy. And it was after the failure of the cadets, and after the failure of the Narodniks, and after the failure of the terrorists that you eventually had the Marxists in Russia, right? Plekhanov was considered the father of Russian Marxism. He differed from the terrorists. He didn't believe in engaging in left adventurism and violence. And he differed from the Narodniks. He didn't believe that the peasants would organize the revolution. The peasants would, and their struggle for land would be that would be how the revolutionary movement in Russia would be successful. That they would engage in organizing factory workers, and Plekhanov is considered the father of Russian Marxism. And it's out of Plekhanov's movement that Bolshevism and Lenin originally emerged. Lenin took the movement, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the Emancipation of Labor group created by Plekhanov, and he took it in a new direction, forming his party of new type. So the word terrorism in the Russian revolutionary lexicon referred to leftists, Marxists, and others who embraced a strategy of engaging in violence and extremism. And that there's books written about Marxism or terrorism, Marxism and terrorism, communism and terrorism. There are books against the strategy of left adventurism, against the strategy of terrorism, written by Marxists. You read Stalin, his book Anarchism or Marxism, that the communist movement was largely arguing against the use of individual terror or left adventurism or violence. Because these things were not having the effect that they wanted. So now that we understand the origin of the word terrorism, and it's like in the 1970s and 80s that the word terrorism takes on the connotation that it has now, right? And in the 70s and 80s, there was a wave of a kind of a revival of people around the world using left adventurist violence. And, what's interesting is that, you had the Red Brigades in Italy, for example. You had the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany. You had the Palestinian resistance that adopted the tactic of kidnappings, taking hostages, etc., in order to extract demands from Israel. And so talk of terrorism in mainstream media, using the connotation we use it now to be, acts of violence directed against civilians primarily, right? That term, the way we understand terrorism now, that kind of comes into being really in the 70s and 80s. That's when the term comes into being. But what's important to note is that during the 1960s and 70s, at that point, what we understand to be terrorism was very much under the complete influence, and it was the bread and butter of American intelligence. For example, in Italy in the 1960s and 70s, they went through a period that they called the Years of Lead. You can read about the Years of Lead in Italy. The Years of Lead. This was a time period from the 1960s until the late 80s where there was all kinds of violence in Italy, political violence between communists and far-right fascists and others. The Years of Lead, because there was so much killing and assassinating and bombing going on, Italy experienced the Years of Lead. Well, why did Italy experience the Years of Lead? Alex Oliveira took the words out of my mouth. Operation Gladio. The CIA was all over Italian politics, and this is documented fact. Look up Operation Gladio. For decades, the CIA was meddling in Italian politics to make sure that a pro-communist government never got elected. Because the communists had been the anti-fascist fighters who had fought against Mussolini. The partisan brigades of Italy, led by communists, had fought against Mussolini. They had been the heroes of especially regions in northern Italy where they fought against the fascist governments. They protected people. And so coming out of the Second World War, the Communist Party of Italy was wildly popular. And it had a lot of support in different regions of the country, most specifically in northern Italy and the mountainous areas. It was very popular. Right? The partisan brigades of Italy. There's a song that people know. Soy comunista, toda la vida. Oh, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Soy comunista, toda la vida. And the partisan brigades that fought against fascism on the side of the United States and the Soviet Union in World War II that were led by communists, they were very popular. And it was understood that the Italian Communist Party might win the elections. So the American government did everything it could to make sure that the Italian Communist Party did not win the elections. And one of the main things they did was fund terrorism. They funded admirers of Mussolini to violently kill communists, to assassinate communist leaders, to shoot members of ethnic minorities, to promote anti-Semitism, and a lot of far-right organizations in Italy were funded by the American government to destabilize Italian politics. But it gets better. In addition to funding the Italian far-right, the U.S. government also funded ultra-left extremist groups, because in addition to the regular Italian Communist Party, you had Trotskyites and Maoists. You had more radical groups that put forward a more radical message. And those groups also got funding from the American government because they would attack the Italian Communist Party and say they were a bunch of phonies and sellouts. And in some cases, they would actually bomb and murder leaders of the Italian Communist Party. And it was revealed throughout the 1970s and 80s, revelations began to emerge. At one point in the late 70s, it was revealed that there was a secret Masonic lodge. You can read about the P2 Lodge or the Propaganda Do Lodge. Again, this sounds like something out of a conspiracy. It's like too crazy to be true, but it is true. Propaganda Do, P2 Masonic Lodge, and that there were a number of Italian members of the parliament who were revealed to be part of this secret Masonic organization that was coordinating with the CIA to kill communists and was smuggling weapons all over the world. And when Propaganda Do, which was a Masonic organization, was revealed, a number of members of the Italian government had to step down because it was revealed that they were involved in all these, in all these assassinations of communists and illegal activities. During the years of lead in Italy, from the 1960s to the 1980s, there were all kinds of bombings and all kinds of assassinations and all kinds of kidnappings and all kinds of ugly political violence. And we now know that the American government and the CIA was all over that. And American weapons were being used, and the American government was arming, different factions, fascist groups, far left, ultra left, adventurist groups. They had the Propaganda Do Lodge, and they were killing people. They were creating all kinds of instability. Why? To prevent the people of Italy from picking their own government. They were afraid, the American government was so afraid that the Italian people might vote wrong and vote for the Communist Party, that the USA not only meddled in Italian politics, right? They didn't just meddle in Italian politics. They manipulated the shit out of Italian politics. They killed people. They gave weapons and guns and support to different groups that killed different people. They manipulated radical factions. The Italians should be furious, and a lot of them are, about how the United States fucked with their country for decades. And they call it the years of lead because there was so much killing involved. And you read about Operation Gladio. The U.S. government went to extreme lengths to manipulate Italian politics to make sure that the communists did not take power. And why did they fear the Italian communists taking power? Because the Italian communists would have pulled Italy out of NATO. They would have removed Italy from the NATO coalition, and they would have established a government that was more friendly to the Soviet Union. And so in order to preserve the hegemony of the West, in order to preserve the NATO alliance, thousands of Italian people were killed. Instability was spread all over Italy for decades. All kinds of people were hurt. And so when the U.S. government says it wants to wage a war on terror, I mean, the U.S. government inflicted decades of terror on Italy in order to keep it in NATO. So, that's one example right there of why the CIA loves terrorism, why we shouldn't be shocked at the possibility, at the very real possibility that it looks like the American government was at least indirectly involved, or at very least had foreknowledge of the recent terrorist attack in Russia. But there are other examples, right? Why do we stop at Operation Gladio? That's not the only example of this, right? For many years, the nation of Angola was divided by civil war. From 1975, when Angola won its independence, until 2002, Angola was in a state of civil war. Angola was a colony of Portugal, and the people there, the black people of Angola, were colonial slaves, and their oil wealth was extracted and used to make money for Portuguese oil companies, and was bad time. Shell Oil, the Wall Street oil company, was making lots of money, and people of Angola weren't doing well. So the people of Angola, they formed an anti-colonial resistance organization called the MPLA, the Movement for the Liberation of the People of Angola. And the MPLA was funded by the Soviet Union, and they fought a war for independence. And they were quite popular. The Angolan people didn't want to be colonial slaves anymore. They didn't want to have apartheid and suffer in their country. They were quite popular. And the U.S. government realized that the people of Angola were going to fight for their freedom, and they were quite popular in doing so. The MPLA was quite popular. And they realized that they couldn't just fight them by supporting the Portuguese. So the U.S. government funded a group called UNITA. And UNITA pretended to also be against the Portuguese colonialists. But UNITA claimed that the MPLA were agents of the Soviet imperialists. And UNITA stood for the Union for the Total Liberation of Angola, because they claimed that the MPLA were agents of the evil Soviet Union. And UNITA was led by a man named Jonas Savimbi. Google Jonas Savimbi, right? Again, when U.S. leaders tell you they're against terrorism, I mean, this takes the cake. Jonas Savimbi was the leader of UNITA in Angola, who was funded by the American government for years. And Jonas Savimbi was not a nice guy, to say the least. Jonas Savimbi was a literal cannibal. He ate people. I'm not exaggerating here. Jonas Savimbi, a literal cannibal, a man who ate other human beings, a Jeffrey Dahmer type dude, was funded by the American government to fight against the MPLA. And as the MPLA was fighting against the Portuguese colonizers, they were also having to fight against UNITA. And then in 1975, the fascist government of Portugal surrendered and they declared independence to all of their colonies. And the MPLA became the new government. But then the CIA started funding giving loads and loads of money to UNITA, to Jonas Savimbi. And from 1975 to 2002, there was a civil war in Angola brought to you by the United States. For how many years is that? Do the math. From 1975 to 2002, they were kept in civil war. This oil-rich African country was kept in civil war by the American government because the American government was giving guns and weapons and military training to a literal cannibal named Jonas Savimbi. And, you know, if you want to see something horrifying, this is Jonas Savimbi, a literal cannibal, a mass murderer, a literal cannibal. Here he is sitting at the White House with Ronald Reagan. That is Ronald Reagan with Jonas Savimbi, the mass murdering literal cannibal of Angola, the leader of UNITA, who is responsible for thousands and thousands of people's death. There he is with the President of the United States. So the American government wants to say, oh, we're against terrorism. They weren't against it in Angola. There is a mass murdering terrorist and cannibal sitting with the President of the United States in the Oval Office. I mean, Jonas Savimbi is responsible for millions of deaths in Angola, at least hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. A brutal mass murderer. He called himself a Maoist communist for a while. Then he became a Jeffersonian Democrat, an evangelical Christian. Not a good dude. Not a good dude, but he was given a hero's welcome. Why? He was fighting the MPLA. He was fighting the communists. The communist government of Angola that was aligned with Cuba. That's who this mass murdering ghoul was fighting against. And so the U.S. government had no problem giving him guns and weapons and enabling him to burn villages and kill people and torture people. And finally, he died in 2002. And immediately after his death, the U.S. government, at that point after his death, the government of Angola signed a peace treaty and the war ended. And then the oil prices shot up because of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And Angola had a huge rate of economic growth. In 2002, the slogan of the government after the Civil War was finally over was Angola starts now. And the capital city of Angola has just exploded in economic growth. And with the help of China in particular, Millions of people have gotten their first job. Millions of people have gotten education. The socialist government of Angola has rapidly improved things since the end of that civil war. But from 1975 to 2002, the American government kept Angola unstable. So this idea that the American government is against terrorism. Oh, Caleb, you can't say that the American government was involved in the Crocus, terrorist act. They would never do that. Bull honky. Bull honky. They did it in Italy. They did it in Angola. But why do we stop there? Why do we stop there? Let's talk about this group, right? You ever heard of the Mujahideen Khalq of Iran? Right? The Mujahideen Khalq, right? In Iran, many years Iran was an absolute monarchy. It was under the Shah of Iran, right? After World War II, Iran had a democratic government, but they elected a guy named Mossadegh, and the USA didn't like Mossadegh, so they overthrew him, and they put the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, back on the throne. And the Shah was a puppet of the United States. He was a brutal murderer. He had a secret police service named Savak that tortured people. The CIA trained Savak on how to torture people. It was awful. But among the Iranian people, there were a lot of Iranians who wanted to overthrow the Shah. And they saw the Shah as a puppet of Western imperialism and colonialism. They wanted to break Iran free. And so there were many different organizations of Iranians that were fighting against imperialism. One of those organizations was called the Tudeh Party, which is the Communist Party of Iran. Another one of those organizations was called the Fedayeen, and they were a breakaway from the Communist Party that engaged in guerrilla warfare. The Tudeh Party organized labor unions. And they had kind of an idea for building labor unions, a peaceful transition to socialism. Then you had the Fedayeen, and they were communist guerrillas that went to the countryside. They were trying to organize some kind of Mao or Che Guevara style guerrilla war in Iran. And then you had a third group in Iran called the Mujahideen Khalq. And they were a group of, they called themselves Islamo-Marxists. They believed in communism and Islam at the same time. And they worshipped a guy named Masoud Rajavi, who they believed was a prophet sent to earth. He was the combined reincarnation of Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, and Vladimir Lenin in one body. And he was going to usher in a global communist and Islamic revolution. Very strange group. And they engaged in terrorism. They killed Americans. They took Americans hostage. They kidnapped Americans. They engaged in bombings. And they were a left adventurous terrorist group that called themselves Islamo-Marxists. And they were designated by the American government as a terrorist organization. And they killed a lot of Americans. And they were just this violent extremist group with that claimed they were Islamo-Marxists, that claimed that their leader was a prophet and was the reincarnation of Muhammad and Jesus and Lenin all in one body. They were a crazy group. Well, we all know what happened. 1979, the Shah of Iran was overthrown, and Iran became the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? Ayatollah Khomeini became the new leader, and they adopted the Islamic Republic. They had a religious government that came to power under the slogan, not capitalism, but Islam, neither East nor West. Well, at first, the Mujahideen Khalq supported the Islamic Republic because they were Muslims as well, and because the Islamic Republic was anti-capitalist and against Western imperialism. However, Khomeini made it very clear he did not want to align with the Soviet Union. He wanted to be neutral. And there was a cleric in the Islamic government that Mujahideen Khalq was close to, and Khomeini fired him, kicked him out of the government. And so the Mujahideen Khalq decided to continue their terrorism, but this time against the Islamic Republic. So they blew up the Iranian parliament. They blew it up. We get mad because a bunch of rednecks ran around the Capitol building where our parliament, our National Assembly, our Congress is. A bunch of rednecks ran around and they farted in Nancy Pelosi's chair, etc. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq blew up the Iranian parliament, and they killed 81 members of the Iranian parliament. The current supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, can't move one of his arms because he was giving a press conference one time, and the Mujahideen-e-Khalq showed up. It was actually a bomb, and they injured his arm so badly he can't move one of his arms. And the Mujahideen-e-Khalq have murdered thousands of Iranians, and they've blown up buildings and they killed people. And the Iranian government cracked down on them, obviously, and it had a big crackdown on communists because of what the Mujahideen-e-Khalq were doing. So the Mujahideen-e-Khalq moved to Iraq and started working for Saddam Hussein. And during the Iraq-Iran war, Saddam Hussein airdropped the Mujahideen-e-Khalq into Iran, and they burned entire villages, and they killed thousands of people. They're just a murderous organization. And after the Iraq-Iran war, they had a special camp set up in Iraq by Saddam Hussein. And from that camp, they would sneak over the border into Iran and bomb buildings and torture people and kidnap people. Mujahideen-e-Khalq are a pretty nasty, evil group of people. And when the USA invaded Iraq in 2003, at that point, they couldn't work for Saddam Hussein anymore. So who did they start working for? The United States. They started working for the United States. And the U.S. government has admitted that Mujahideen-e-Khalq work with Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, and they killed Iranian nuclear scientists. There are some Iranians that were helping set up their nuclear energy program, and the Mujahideen-e-Khalq murdered them. I'll show you a picture. These nuclear scientists that were helping Iran engage in scientific research, these guys were not soldiers. They were not engaged in any military activities. These guys were peaceful nuclear scientists, and the Mujahideen-e-Khalq worked with Israel to murder them. It's horrifying. It's just utterly horrifying. 5 nuclear scientists who worked with the Iranian peaceful nuclear energy program, these 5 men, they were killed by the Mujahideen-e-Khalq terrorists who were working with Israel to kill them, murdered them. And the U.S. government listed the Mujahideen-e-Khalq as a terrorist organization because they were, they'd killed Americans, they were working for Saddam Hussein, etc. But then Hillary Clinton dropped them from being the terrorist organization. Hillary Clinton delisted them from being terrorists, and she dropped their designation as a terrorist organization. And a number of American elected officials have spoken at their rallies. This group of Islamo-Marxist terrorists, they're called, they've gotten the endorsement of loads of American politicians. This is Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City. He was the mayor. He was America's mayor after 9/11. But here he is speaking at a rally of the Mujahideen-e-Khalq terrorist organization, a group that has killed Americans, a group that murdered peaceful nuclear scientists, a group that engages in assassinations. That's the image of Miriam Rajavi, the wife of the founder, Masoud Rajavi. And that's Rudy Giuliani speaking at a rally for a terrorist organization that murders Iranians because they kill Iranians, because they're against Iran. He loves them, right? And Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, has all kinds of American politicians who kiss their ass. It's shocking. All throughout the political spectrum, you will see American political leaders who happily speak at their events, happily get funded by them, get money from them. I mean, it's shocking that this group is an open terrorist organization. They call themselves Islamo-Marxists. They're not Marxists. They're not Muslims. And they're just a group of murderous terrorists. But here's Mike Pence, right? Mike Pence standing next to their leader. Mike Pence standing next to Miriam Rajavi, the leader of the Mujahideen Khalq, the terrorist organization that has killed thousands of innocent Iranians. There it is. There's Rudy Giuliani hanging out with, or I'm sorry, that's Mike Pence, the neoconservative former vice president, hanging out with the Mujahideen Khalq. Right? Doesn't matter that they've killed people. Doesn't matter that they've tortured people and kidnapped people. Doesn't matter that they worked for Saddam Hussein. Doesn't matter that they were designated as American terrorists for years. They killed nuclear scientists. But, they're against Iran. They're against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Look, you can see they got the flag there, the Shah flag with the lion and the sword, and they're against Iran. So he loves them. He loves them. For years, Russia dealt with Chechen separatists, people that were trying to break Chechnya, an Islamic region of Russia, away from the Russian Federation. And all over American media, the Chechen separatists were portrayed as heroes, were portrayed as fighting against the evil Russian government, blah, 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 blah. And American media cheered for the terrorists in Chechnya that took hostages, that murdered people. There's many examples of this. Many examples of this. Right? Again, here we go. Again, I at risk of telling you all what you already know, right? Afghanistan, the People's Democratic Party that was friendly to Russia took power in 1978 in an event called the Sour Revolution. And so the U.S. government wanted to overthrow the People's Democratic Party. So who did they find to help them do it? Who did they arm and train and give all kinds of support to help them overthrow the People's Democratic Party in Afghanistan? None other than Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi. You remember Osama bin Laden? Well, Osama bin Laden was paid by the American government and utilized by the American government in Afghanistan to fight against the People's Democratic Party and the Soviet Union that backed up the People's Democratic Party. The U.S. government couldn't stand that Afghanistan in the 1970s had a government that was sympathetic to Russia and the Soviet Union. So the U.S. government trained and armed Osama bin Laden and the forces that eventually became Al-Qaeda. It trained and it armed them to fight against the Soviet Union. These are facts. No one can deny these facts. These are just facts. These are facts. Right? There's no denying any of this. Right? Zbigniew Brzezinski, you can read about how he bragged about the Afghan trap. The Afghan trap. And how they created a situation where the Soviet Union felt it had no choice but to militarily intervene in Afghanistan. And then they created a prolonged insurgency. Their goal, they said, was to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. Give the Soviet Union a Vietnam. Google the Afghan trap and Brzezinski. Right? Zbigniew Brzezinski arranged for Osama bin Laden and the forces that eventually became Al-Qaeda to set up shop and have a long-term ugly war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union and against the People's Democratic Party. These are facts. These are facts. I mean, I could continue, and I will continue. Nicaragua, right? The government of Nicaragua in the 1970s, they had a socialist revolution, and the Sandinistas, a group of Christian socialists, took power and created the government of Nicaragua. So the U.S. government funded the Contras, which were a group of terrorists that were trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. And not only were the Contras trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, they were also selling crack. Crack was brought to the United States, was synthesized and brought to the United States by the Contras. Gary Webb, the heroic journalist who died under mysterious circumstances. Gary Webb revealed, he was the author of Dark Alliance, he revealed that the Contras that were funded by the U.S. government, that were used by the American government to fight against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, they are the people that brought crack cocaine to the United States. Read about Gary Webb. Crack plague's roots are in the Nicaraguan War. That's Gary Webb, and he revealed it. He actually got video footage of cocaine being loaded onto American government planes. That at the same time that the Contras were fighting to overthrow socialism in Nicaragua, fighting against the elected socialist government of Nicaragua, they were also bringing cocaine and crack into the United States. And the crack epidemic of the 1980s was brought to America by a group of terrorists who were funded by the American government in Central America. And I mean, the story doesn't end there. Anyone who knows anything about Central America, about Honduras, about Guatemala, about Colombia, which is in South America, anyone who knows anything about that region knows that the drug gangs that had U.S.-made weapons and were involved in the efforts to overthrow socialism in the 1980s in El Salvador and elsewhere, those groups have only gotten bigger. And the body count, they always want to give us a body count. Communism killed a bajillion, gamillion people. Communism killed 100. Add up all the people in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua and Mexico and Colombia who have died as a result of the U.S. government giving guns and training and weapons to in the 1970s and 80s. The body count that has resulted from that, the number of people who have died as a result of the U.S. government funding terrorism in Central America and South America, is massive. I mean, we're talking millions of people. So the idea that the American government would be involved in a terrorist attack against Russia, against a government that they don't like in Russia, against a government aligned with Russia, this is par for the course. If the U.S. government can fund Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan to fight against Russia, if the American government can fund Chechen separatists to fight against Russia, if the American government can fund the UNITA terrorists to fight against the MPLA in Russia, if the American government can carry out the years of lead and destabilize Italy for decades and fund all kinds of terrorist groups to make sure they don't elect a government that's aligned with Russia, if the American government can spend millions of dollars and fund drug-dealing, murderous drug cartels in Central America in order to make sure that try and overthrow a government in Nicaragua that's friendly with Russia, why is anyone at all surprised that it looks very much like this horrendous terrorist attack that just happened in Moscow was carried out with at least some indirect involvement by the American government? The American government knew it was going to happen ahead of time. The American government announced that there was going to be extremist attacks on concert halls, and then it happened. And the U.S.-backed and U.S.-funded and U.S.-propped-up regime in Ukraine was ready to meet those terrorists at the border. Why is it an outlandish claim to suspect that the American government may have been at least indirectly linked to this horrendous attack? There's nothing out. It makes perfect sense. What's horrifying, what's absolutely horrifying, is that there's not more outrage about it. That's what's more horrifying. What's more horrifying is that there's a layer of people who have been so brainwashed by mainstream media that I can show you facts up and down about the USA funding the MEK and the USA funding the years of lead in Italy and Operation Gladio and the MPLA. I can show you facts about UNITA and I can show you all of this, and they will just sit there and go, that's a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory. Oh, you must be a Trumper. You must be a Republican. Oh, I bet the Holocaust didn't happen. I mean, it's they have brainwashed a layer of people in the United States to not believe things, not because the facts aren't there, because it sounds like something that a bad person would say. And this is, I can't stand this, right? This is how Republicans and conservatives used to be during the Bush years, right? If you pointed out that Saddam Hussein had at one point been funded by the United States, you pointed out that Osama bin Laden had at one point been funded by the United States, you'd say this to conservatives. They'd say, that's not true. That sounds like something someone who's against America would say. And you could show them all the facts, and they would say, "Nuh-uh, America's a good country, okay? I don't want to hear it," because they were conservatives, and they didn't have any facts to counter what you were saying, but they knew that people that say America does bad things are bad people, so you can't believe them. And that's what liberals have become. They can't debunk anything I just said here. Everything I just said here about Afghanistan, about Angola, about Iran, about Chechnya, you name it, about Italy, all the stuff I just said of the U.S. government funding all kinds of ugly acts of terrorism around the world because they want to weaken Russian influence. They want to dominate the globe and prevent any country from establishing national liberation or independence and socialism. None of that can be refuted. All of that is very, very factual. This is the history of the American government. However, there's a layer of people in the United States that don't. Well, that sounds like something a Trumper would say. Why? Why does that sound like something that, and they don't, just because it sounds like something that somebody bad might say. They've decided Trumpers are bad, right? I know plenty of Trumpers that are great people. But it sounds like something that a Trumper would say, so it must be false. Just like the neocons, just like the Bush supporters during the early years of the 21st century. Now it's the same kind of thing. The idea that the American government would fund terrorism against Russia, like that's a no-brainer. Of course they would. They've been doing it for years and bragging about it. And so all the facts seem to indicate that the U.S. government was at least indirectly involved. They knew this attack was going to happen. And there's nothing scandalous, nothing shocking about saying that. And the facts are all there. It's an absolutely abominable and shameful moment for our country, because when America shows its true colors and when we are on the side of right in history, Russia is always on our side. In the American Revolution, to fight for our independence against the British Empire, Russia was on our side. In the fight to defeat slavery, Russia was on the side of Abraham Lincoln. The British were thinking about breaking the blockades from the South, and Russia sent its navy to New York City's harbor to stand with Abraham Lincoln and make clear that they were not going to let the British do that. Russia protected the United States, kept the British from getting involved in the U.S. Civil War. In the fight against Hitler and the Nazis, Russia was on our side. Every time America is doing good in the world, we're fighting the Nazis, we're fighting against slavery, we're fighting the British Empire, Russia's on our side. But it's when America is on the wrong side, when America is doing bad, that seems to be when we're opposing the Russians. Vietnam, the Russians were on the side of the Vietnamese people, fighting for their national liberation. America was on the wrong side. Korea, America was trying to prevent the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. It was making sure they couldn't have elections for the entire peninsula where every party could be involved. And America was on the wrong side in the Korean War, and the Russians were on the right side. They wanted a unified government for the whole peninsula where every party, the Korean Workers' Party and the conservative and Christian parties, they could all be in one unified government. Nicaragua, where the U.S. government was supporting the drug dealers and the narco gangs and the terrorists. Russia was on the side of the Sandinistas. All over the world, when America is doing wrong, we're fighting Russia. And when America is doing the right thing, fighting the British Empire to establish our country, fighting against slavery with Abraham Lincoln, fighting against the Nazis in World War II, Russia's on our side. And also, let me add that when America is on the wrong side, who always tends to be there? The British Empire. The British. The British Empire, with their free trade and their Malthusianism, their belief there's just too many people in the world, we've got to reduce the population, and their belief that we don't need economic development. We could just rake in super profits from all over the world to go to great financial centers in Wall Street and London. That international empire of the sea, that thalassocracy, imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage. That system is something that the British Empire is all about. And you'll notice that generally the forces in the United States that are the most anti-Russian tend to be the most British aligned. But I believe that the American people are better than this. And our country was founded in opposition to the British Empire, in opposition to imperialism, in opposition to a global economic system that holds back development. And the Civil War was largely not just a war against slavery. It was a war against the British Empire that wanted to hold back development, that wanted the slave plantations of the South as cheap cotton for their textile mills. And that, unfortunately, as even though the British were on the right side in World War II, the British royal family was not. The King of England had to step down because he was known to be a Nazi sympathizer. The British royal family had extensive ties to the Nazis. The British had funded the Nazis to fight the communists in Germany before they took power. And that fascism and the British Empire walk hand in hand. The British Empire is not a friend of the American people. America began as a country breaking out of the British system, and that the negative axis in the United States, the forces in the United States that are the most imperialistic and the most in favor of war and genocide and a police state at home and free market economics and Malthusianism and reducing the population, the forces that are driving the low-wage police state, they're tied up closely with the British Empire. So what I would advocate is a continental shift in American politics. The USA needs to not be part of the British global oligarchical thalassocracy financial system. The United States needs to become a continental nation. The vast territories of our country, the vast heartland of our country needs to be revitalized. We need schools and hospitals. We need high-speed railway. We need to see the United States as a bastion of natural resources and wealth. We need to rebuild the United States to be a continental nation full of industrial growth. We have a 4-point economic plan at the Center for Political Innovation for rebuilding the United States. Step 1 would be hiring the unemployed and putting them to work in a mass public works program, rebuilding the infrastructure of the country. Second step would be public ownership of our natural resources. America's oil, America's coal, America's timber, America's natural gas should be public property. And the wealth created from our natural resources should go into the public budget. That's step number 2. Step number 3 would be public control of our banking system. The lending of money should be done in the interest of the country overall. Has forbidden the lending of money at interest. The Quran, the Torah, the Bible has forbidden usury because it leads to a creditor class. The usurer the money lender, makes money by having money. They have money, they lend it to somebody, they get interest in return, and that is how they make money. And they make money from other money, right? They don't create any value in the process. And usury has been forbidden by every major religion, because when you have a group of people that make money by having money and don't create any value, physical economy is diminished, and you get a creditor class that is exponentially richer than everybody else. And that is something that should be opposed, right? And so instead of having private bankers and credit card companies and payday lender money sharks and those kind of forces, we should have a national bank. We should have state banks. We should have local community banks that are under public ownership and lend strategically in the interest of making sure there is economic growth in the entire nation. We should have public control of banking, and we should have a debt jubilee. We should cancel the debt and enact public control of banking. That's step number 3. And step number 4 would be the enactment of an economic bill of rights for the American people: the right to jobs, the right to health care, the right to education. And if you enacted those 4 steps, the United States economy would rejuvenate, and you would have a booming economy in the United States. This would be good for the small business owners. This would be good for the industrial workers. This would be good for the young people. And this would be good for the people in the South. It'd be good for the people in the Midwest. It'd be good for the people in the Pacific Northwest. It would be an economic reboot of the entire nation if we enacted the 4 economic points that I just mentioned, right? The economy of the United States would boom. But in order to enact these 4 economic points, you would have to defeat the bankers and the oil companies. Right? You'd have to defeat the power of the Eastern establishment, of the ultra monopolies of the British Empire. The Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Silicon Valley fascists, the ultra monopolies that run the United States would have to be defeated. That this program would rejuvenate the country, and it would allow a lot of people to become rich, a lot of people to start their own businesses, a lot of new corporations to spring up, a lot of working class people to have a better future. This is the kind of program that could build an anti-monopoly coalition, right? And we at the Center for Political Innovation are trying to build an anti-monopoly coalition so that we can have a government of action that fights for working families. Right now, we have a government of the rich. We have a government that rolls over and plays dead so that Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and the ultra monopolies can rape this country. We have a government that is in dereliction of duty, right? If you're a parent in the United States and your child is coming to school without the proper clothes that they need, and your child is not being properly fed, and you're too busy partying and taking care of yourself to care for your child, you get arrested. That's called criminal neglect. And I charge the government of the United States with criminal neglect. Because while our roads are falling apart, while our schools are a joke, while inflation is squeezing working families, while our water is not being properly purified, while our power plants are falling apart, our politicians, the ultra-rich politicians and their paymasters, are partying with Zelensky, and they're partying with Netanyahu, and they have neglected the American people. I charge the government of the United States with criminal neglect. They have let this country rot while they've enriched their friends in Ukraine and in Israel and in London. And it's about time that we had a government that didn't let the country rot in order to feed a corrupt international system. It's instead time that we had a government of action that fights for working families. We need a government that doesn't bend over backwards to enable Jeff Bezos. We need a government that kicks Jeff Bezos' ass. That's the kind of government that we need in the United States. A government that kicks ass and fights for the people. A government that forces economic growth, that stabilizes the economy, that gives hope to the next generation. Imagine if we had a government that designed social media apps that made children smarter and healthier, not dumber and mentally ill. Imagine that we had a government that was training young Americans to be scientists and engineers. Imagine that young people in America were taught to be proud of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Abraham Lincoln and the struggle to defeat slavery. Imagine that we had a government in the United States that mobilized young people to be proud of the fight against fascism in World War II. Imagine that we had a government that cooperated with Russia and cooperated with China. Imagine that we hired the China Railway Corporation to build high-speed railway to connect the United States to the heartland, to the Midwest, the heartland of the Midwest to the East Coast. We built a high-speed railway that would take you from Los Angeles to California in a couple hours, from Los Angeles to New York in a couple hours. Imagine we had a government that went all in on fusion energy and decided that we were going to get beyond fossil fuels to a higher energy source. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation is striving to create, a government of action that will fight for working families and rebuild a new America with hope and optimism and economic growth beyond the pessimism of the left and the individualism and greed of the right, a new America for working families. That's what the Center for Political Innovation strives to create, a new America beyond imperialism. We are the true patriots. To truly love America is to want to break it free from the system that is destroying America. To truly love America is to want America to be friends with Russia and China and the Middle East and many countries around the world. To truly love America is to want an America beyond imperialism. We are the true patriots. We are the true patriots because there is no contradiction between patriotism and internationalism. To be a true internationalist, you must love your home country. And to be a true patriot, you must want your home country to be at peace with the rest of the world. We are the true patriots. We are the true internationalists. We need a government of action to fight for working families. That is the vision of the Center for Political Innovation. An America beyond imperialism. An America that is not aligned with terrorists. So on that note, folks, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? I'll start calling people out as I see them. All right. Who's with us? Names and locations. We got Noah in Boston. Noah is great. He asked a great question at the Putin session. Noah is awesome. He was at the World Youth Festival with us. Alex in Oregon. Gabby in Chicago. Onion, Spur. Gonzalo in Argentina. David Rennie in Ontario. Zach in Richmond, Virginia. Ian Chester in England. JC Fullerton in California, Frank in Nashville, Tennessee, Mosen in Colorado, Nelson in Massachusetts, Billy Kane in Gateshead, England, Steve and Ann in Ringgold, Georgia, Canadian political refugee in Bogota, Ed in Louisville, Andy from Glasgow, Mirwas in Oslo, John McCarthy in Chicago, Oregon, Gary Sullivan, Moab in Utah, Canadian political refugee in Bogota, Shasta County, California. Wow. Okay. Getting dark in California. Wyoming, Winesburg, Ohio. Jane from New York in Italy. Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati. Al in Sydney. Chris in Salt Lake City, Travis in Sydney, Texas, Hutch in Texas, Misha in Miami, Alex in Brazil, Mishumo in Catalonia, Four Oaks, North Carolina, Bob Troy in New York, Alex in Brazil, Rizwan in Rochdale, the island of Danke, Dan Keating in New Jersey. Welcome, Dan. Cincinnati, great place, Jenny. Black Forest, Germany. Manchester, United Kingdom. There we go. There we go. Hello from Chicago, says CP Haas. Antarctica. Freezing cold here. Oh, Brazil. Oh, Brazil. Our home and native land. Anyway. Viva la Catalans. Newcastle, Australia. From hell. Bum, bum, bum. All righty. Someone from Turkey. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Hamayon from Pakistan. Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Nelson says, God bless you all. Well, God bless you as well. I'm so glad that all of you are with us tonight. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell. So good to have you all here. As we got anyone on the, we got Moab from Utah is on the Rumble. On the Rockfin, do we have anybody? No, we don't. Yeah, we got one super chat so far. So if you've got anything you want me to talk about in the second half of our program, by all means, send a super chat, Rumble rant, or Rockfin tip, or else this is going to be a very short live stream. I need something to react to, folks. So send something my way. Give me something to talk about. Do want to remind you all, just like I did earlier. We got Rice from Adelaide, Australia, Kay in New Orleans, Emperor Penguin in Texas. Do want to remind you all that we are having a national weekend retreat that's coming up in Vermont, and it's going to be awesome. Hold on. It's going to be great. I'm just going to get the picture on the screen here. All righty. And it's going to be great. So I hope that you will sign up. It's going to be a 4-day educational workshop for the Center for Political Innovation. It will be in the state of Vermont, and it's going to be great. I hope that you will join. I hope that you will join us. A lot of great classes, a lot of getting to know you activities. We are building a community of solidarity, a network of anti-imperialists. So if you can make it, here's the link to register for our 4-day national gathering. I hope that you will be there. It's going to be a 4-day educational retreat. It's going to be great. I dropped the link in the chat. I'll drop it on the Rockfin and on the Rumble. But we'd love to have you with us. So sign up if you get a chance. It would be really great to have you there. It's going to be 4 days of socialist education, etc. in the U.S. state of Vermont. It's going to be pretty awesome. So, all righty. And now this is the part where I tell you all that I really do need your support. Part of what keeps this channel going. I do live in a rather expensive New York City apartment, but so that I can do these live streams. So I do need you all to support this channel by sending super chats to give me something to talk about, by buying my books, signing up on Patreon, etc. I do need your support as a community so that I can do these streams regularly and I can continue to produce the content that I produce here. I will add that the money of the Center for Political Innovation, I don't have access to that money in any way. So if you're joining CPI or you're donating to CPI, great, we appreciate it, but I don't handle those funds. Those funds fund CPI activities. I don't even have access to those bank accounts. So if you send a super chat here, or if you sign up on the Patreon, you are supporting me and my work. And if you donate to CPI, you're donating to CPI. And it's important that there be distinction. So there's no confusion. There's no innuendo. That's important. So I did want to mention that, just so we're clear on that. But yes, if you would like to support this channel, if you like the work that I do here, please send a super chat, ask me a question, get me talking about something. That helps make this program and these live streams what they are. I get on here and I talk a lot and I stream as much as I can. Right now, I've got a little bit of allergies, but I'm feeling better than I was the other day. I'm still resting up from my big trip, trying to slow things down. as we head into the month of April. But I'm very excited. We're doing great work as an organization. We need anti-imperialism in America more than ever. We need anti-imperialism. I'm still horrified by the events in Russia, but it is what it is. And I'm just, trying to raise awareness about where these attacks probably came from. We got Tim, who's in Rochester. So yes, if people can send a super chat, get me talking, that would be great. So now I'm going to start answering. I've only got one super chat here, and it's from Edward. And Edward says, speaking of Angola, could you comment on Paul Manafort and Roger Stone turning Savimbi into a darling of the American empire in the 1980s? I can comment on that for sure. Trump is a Republican, as you're well aware. And the Republicans were the more hardline pro-imperialist party in the 1980s. They were the Reagan party. And during those years, the hard right were the main allies that the United States had in the fight against communism around the world. And this is, there's a lot of nuance to this, and I've talked about this. For example, in Latin America, during these years, it was the Contras, and it was the military, and it was people like Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and people like Rios Montt in Guatemala, who were the main allies of the United States. And the United States has been largely reinventing its international strategy because those folks are largely hated. And in Latin America, the big game changer for Bolivarianism, the reason Hugo Chavez got into office and was very popular, and the reason that that we saw the rise of Evo Morales and the Sandinistas were back in office and all of this was because the indigenous people of Latin America were voting, and that that hard right was very racist. So there you go. And it's interesting because now we're seeing in Africa, and this new president of Indonesia is a great example. This is somebody that comes out of the military right wing. He was part of the dictatorship in Indonesia, anti-communist, but now he wants peace with Russia and China, and he's talking about opposing colonialism and imperialism. We're seeing that the United States has kind of rearranged its international ties. The United States is now very friendly to the what you might call we got the George Soros apparatus, the color revolution apparatus that creates instability in countries, that promotes the LGBT stuff. And because of that, you have many of these kind of nationalistic leaders that were very anti-communist during the Cold War that are now friendlier to Russia and China as they see the United States spreading instability. And so the USA has really changed. The hard right that used to be the USA's allies, the militarist right wing that is kind of nationalistic, they were the main allies of the United States during the Cold War. Now the United States has aligned itself with this kind of the color revolution apparatus, the NGOs, etc. And so it's not surprising that people that are in the Trump camp, like Paul Manafort, like Roger Stone, were people that were hard anti-communists during the Reagan years. And they're also now at odds because, again, we're seeing that, imperialism has very much done the woke thing. They've given themselves a woke makeover. And this is something I talk about extensively. And in my book, Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution, where is America going? I talk about this, and that, the dynamic of everything has changed. The left of today is not the left of the Cold War. The right of today is not the right of the Cold War. And, I'm at the point where, I mean, there are people that I'm friendly with politically now. I never thought in a million years I would be friendly with. And there are people that's, at least ideologically on paper sound like me, and that they say they believe in socialism, say positive things about the Soviet Union, who hate my guts, and that we are in new political terrain, right? We are in new political terrain where the dividing line is not, are you a communist? Are you a capitalist? The dividing line is very much, are you in favor of humanity expanding and growing? Do you believe in economic growth? Do you believe in humanity? Or do you believe in degrowth? Do you believe in instability and chaos? That's much more the dividing line nowadays, because the main way imperialism justifies its activities is in the name of woke stuff, human rights, LGBT rights, etc. And the forces that are opposing imperialism now are largely nationalistic. They are trying to stabilize their countries and have economic development, whereas the imperialists believe that growth is bad and that growth must be stopped because of climate change. And so there's been a whole new alignment, and things are not as they used to be. And I've written about this extensively, and the new textbook that's coming out for our Vermont retreat goes into detail about this. This is not the Cold War anymore, right? In the Cold War political setup, where you have the left versus the right, it doesn't line up anymore, because the left are more regime change oriented. They're more in favor of mainstream narratives. They want to marginalize and suppress dissidents. And the right are people that are more anti-war, but they are more nationalistic. They tend to think that the imperialists are communists for some reason. They kind of represent the lower level of capital in opposition to the ultra monopolies, but that makes them more sympathetic to Russia and China. So it's all mixed up and confused, right? And that's why the Center for Political Innovation is so important, because we have a new understanding, right? We have engaged in political innovation, right? Go and visit our website, cpiusa.org. Right? For political innovation. And look at what we do, right? We just sent a great delegation to the World Youth Festival in Russia. I was an election observer representing the Center for Political Innovation. We are breaking new ground. We are political pioneers because we are in new political territory. And if you're sticking to Cold War politics, you're going to get left behind. So there you go. All right. Assange extradition ruling in the morning. Julian Assange being extradited to the United States would be so wrong. I really hope that he stays in the United Kingdom, because him coming to the United States, he doesn't stand a chance. They'll torture him, and the whole case is outrageous. Julian Assange, he didn't leak classified information. He was never a U.S. government employee. He's not even a U.S. citizen, Julian Assange. Julian Assange just created a platform, WikiLeaks. And with that platform, he enabled people to reveal U.S. government secrets. And for that, they have wanted to get him so bad. And they have tortured this man for decades. And that's not enough. Now they want to bring him to the United States. So we'll be paying attention to that ruling. We'll be reacting to that ruling. Okay. Chris asks me, how did you arrange your trip to Russia with a ban on Aeroflot in the U.S.? Planning my next trip. Well, Chris, what I did was I contacted several illegal drug dealing terrorist organizations, and I gave them my blood, and I offered up my wife as a hostage. And then we robbed hundreds of banks, and together we then funded my plane tickets. Dude, I'm being sarcastic, obviously, Chris, but you can go to Russia. You can book tickets to Russia, right? You can do that. I mean, get on the internet. You can book tickets to Russia. I'm not going to get into the specifics of these things. I don't generally get into the specifics of these things. But yes, Aeroflot is not in the United States, but I still went to Russia, and you can still go to Russia too. You have to get a visa, but you can, there's ways to go to Russia. So yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you. Gala is appreciating my answer there. But there you go. So there we go. And thank you, Gordon, for your super chat there. Did you think Ukraine might become the U.S.'s Suez Canal? That's interesting. What do you mean by that? Right? The Suez Canal is a canal that connects the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. It's located in Egypt, and it's a very vital point in international maritime trade because it's very narrow, and going through it can take some time. When the Suez Canal gets clogged, it generally results in a rise in oil prices, etc. And control over the Suez Canal is something that's very strategic for Egypt. The Egyptian government really benefits from having it there. But what do you mean by that, Saviero? I mean, what specifically are you referring to? Suez is when the British Empire knew their time was up. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I don't know if I would put it that way. I mean, the Suez Canal, the British created it, right? It was financed by the Rothschilds, but the British Empire kind of, and the British Empire is still British imperialism and British capital. I mean, American imperialism and American capital. In a lot of ways, the American ultra-monopolies are an extension of British ultra-monopolies. Now you're referring to the 1956 Suez War, right? Which was a conflict in the Middle East. I mean, yeah, I do know that, the Panama Canal is kind of the closest thing to the Suez Canal. It's another vitally important maritime route that the United States controls. And one of the reasons the USA doesn't like the government of Nicaragua, one of the reasons, is that the government of Nicaragua is trying to build a canal to counter the Panama Canal. And the government of Nicaragua is friendly to China, and they want to build a canal through Nicaragua that will be an alternative to the Panama Canal that is controlled by the United States. And that's a big threat to the United States. Oh, I see. Me Hutch asked a pretty big question. So we'll look into that. But thank you, Saviero. China is buying up U.S. land. That is, first of all, right, people in China may be buying some U.S. land. But as you know, right, foreign nationals in this country can have their property seized at any time. And, I mean, the bulk of American land is controlled by American agribusiness. I think the main issue there is not China buying up land. It's that the Biden administration is actively trying to reduce global crop outputs. That is an issue, right? The fact that the American government is at this point trying to reduce the amount of food in the world. This is why the farmers are revolting in Europe. This is why all over the African continent and all over the third world, you have the United States and BlackRock trying to impose organic farming that reduces crop outputs. It's insane. The environmental folks at the World Economic Forum have decided there's too much food in the world. And because of that, they are trying to reduce global crop outputs. And it's completely insane in the name of global warming. That's the issue there, right? Are there Chinese corporations that possibly have bought some land in the United States? Sure. And I'm not losing any sleep over it. And I can guarantee you that if that served any military value for China, if that was somehow a threat to American sovereignty, the American government would be all over it. I mean, look at the TikTok thing. TikTok has absolutely nothing to do with China. It is in no way pushing Chinese government propaganda. It is in no way doing anything to serve Chinese foreign policy. And the U.S. government is losing their minds over it just because they don't control it. Because there's a parent company in China that has some ownership of some shares of stocks. And just because of that, the U.S. government's losing their mind. So you tell me that, if there was any threat posed by Chinese land, look, China, there's a weather balloon flies over the United States and the country practically has a meltdown, right? And so you're telling me that, that, oh my God, China's going to buy up all our food. I mean, come on, right? The anti-China hysteria is one of the worst things that Republicans are doing right now. And it's stupid and it's dumb. And, it's like it mirrors the anti-Russia hysteria coming from Republicans or come from Democrats. I mean, it's stupid. It's very, very, very stupid. Russia is not our enemy. China is not our enemy. Wall Street is our enemy. And Wall Street is trying to reduce the amount of food in the world for deranged Malthusian environmental reasons that must be opposed. So there you go. All righty. And thank you, Gordon, for your super chat. What is your opinion on red flag legislation? and mass immigration to the U.S. Okay. So I think I know what you mean by red flag legislation. That's things that prevent people from doing acts of terrorism, right? Like red flag gun protections, right? That's what it is, right? So there's a couple layers to this, right? The first thing is that, so we'll talk about red flag laws, and then we'll talk about mass immigration. So the problem with red flag laws is this. The U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest body, they read the U.S. Constitution as saying that owning a firearm is a constitutional right. Okay? Now, you can disagree with that all you want, right? And people do. There's a lot of Americans who say, well, it means well-regulated militia or it's out. Okay, fine. Disagree with that all you want. But right now, the law of the land, the reading of the Constitution by the Supreme Court, is that owning a firearm in the United States is on the same level as your right to vote, as on the same level as your right to freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So if something is a constitutional right, it cannot be taken away unless you break the law, right? If you break the law, right, if you're convicted of a crime, they can take away your freedom of speech. They can take away your freedom of assembly, etc. But until you break the law, they cannot take away a constitutional right. So a red flag law, right? Some of these red flag laws would make it illegal for somebody who's on, like, for example, the terrorism watch list to buy a gun. Well, the thing is, unless people are put on that list because they broke the law, that can't be constitutional, right? Because we argue that owning a firearm is on the same level as freedom of speech or freedom of religion, right? And so a law that would say, oh, anyone on the terrorism watch list cannot buy a gun, that doesn't work that way unless you're convicted of a crime or unless they rule that owning a gun is not the equivalent of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. It doesn't work that way, right? And red flag legislation, the intent, right? The reason it's called red flag legislation is if somebody looks like they're going to commit an act of violence, right? If someone's going to, if someone looks like the profile of somebody who would commit, an act of terrorism, that they're prevented from acquiring a gun, they're preemptively arrested or something like that. Well, you can understand that could be done with good intent. That's not necessarily some deep state conspiracy or something like that. That's not, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That if there's a horrendous act of terrorism, the government steps in and prevents it for the safety of the public. Now, one thing that they do have in the United States is background checks to buy a gun. And that is that, there's a list, I believe the federal background or the federal, what is it? The federal waiting period. It's not background checks. It's a waiting period where if you go and buy a gun, they run your name and there are millions of Americans that are on a list where you don't get your gun for a couple days. And that list is very big and very long. And that list, they don't disclose why people are on the list, but it's understood. And that list exists to prevent suicides, to prevent violence, to prevent, and that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Making people wait a couple days to get their gun. I think that's sensible, right? There may be people who want to kill themselves. They go and buy the gun, but then they have to wait 3 days. And after 3 days, when they finally get the gun, they don't want to kill themselves. There may be people who are really, really angry, right? And they go to buy the gun to kill somebody. And then after 3 or 4 days, they don't want to kill somebody anymore. Well, I'm not against that, right? Making people wait a few days to buy their gun if they fit a certain profile, I don't see anything wrong with that, right? However, as a society, we as America have said that owning a gun is on the same level as freedom of assembly, freedom, as long as that is the law of the land. As long as that is the law of the land, laws that would prevent people from owning guns, people that otherwise have constitutional rights, aren't gonna fly, right? And that is something, I've had people get very upset and angry about this with me, and I'm just telling you, I'm not arguing one way or another. I mean, I am not in favor of gun control because the first gun laws that were ever passed in the United States were to disarm black people, and prevent former slaves from owning guns, to stop the Black Panthers. and that as much as I sympathize with parents who worry about their kids being killed in a mass shooting, and I'm not going to ridicule people that are in favor of gun control. I understand why they're concerned, but as somebody who sees the American government as not good, and as somebody who's concerned about some of the implications of the gun control crowd, the people that are pushing for gun control always seem to be people that they want it imposed on people because of their political beliefs. Well, they want it imposed on people because of their political beliefs or because of their background or whatever. I'm not okay with that. So, in New York City, there was a gun control policy that we had for years called stop and frisk, right? And it was the police searched anybody on the subway. They could stop anybody and frisk them for guns on the subway. And it was horrible. And it was an awful thing for the black community. It was in Harlem and in the Bronx and all that stop and frisk where the NYPD would just get on the subway and randomly search people for guns with no probable cause. It was degrading. It was an awful thing that the black community was subjected to. And there was all kinds of protests by leftists and by socialists and others to oppose it. And nobody acknowledged stop and frisk. If you read about stop and frisk, what was stop and frisk? Stop and frisk was a gun control law. What were they stopping and frisking people for, right? Read about stop and frisk. What was it? It was a gun. They were stopping and frisking people to look for guns. And it was completely unconstitutional. It was a violation of their right, to be protected from unreasonable search and seizure. And it was a gun control policy. So I just don't like gun control. Generally, I am suspicious of gun control. I'm not a gun owner myself. I don't own a gun. I can't. I'm in New York City. And I mean, if you getting a gun in New York City, you have to get a permit, and the permit is like impossible to get. And so, absolutely it is. And, and so you can't have a gun in New York City. If I lived in another state, would I own a gun? I might not. I don't know. I would have to think about that. But I live in New York City now, and you can't own a gun in New York City. So the second part of your question, Mihaj, was about what are my thoughts on mass migration to the U.S.? Well, this is a nuanced question because first things first, mass migration isn't good. It's not, right? The fact that they find dead bodies every day along the Mexican border, not good. It's not a good situation. It is not a good thing. Okay. It's one thing if people just want to come to a new country or whatever, but that's not the situation. Mass migration from south of the border to the United States is a bad situation. It's bad for the people that are coming here. It's bad for the country. It's bad for everybody. Okay. And I think we can just acknowledge that. We can just acknowledge that the mass migration situation is bad. It's the result of U.S. foreign policy. It's the result of the USA sending weapons and training drug cartels and destabilizing South and Central America. And that it is, but it's a bad situation. And just saying that it's the fault of the American government doesn't make it okay. And doesn't mean we. So my issue with the left is the left acts like mass migration is fine. It's not fine. It's not a good situation. It's a bad situation. That's my issue with the left. Is the left applauds mass migration. They're just like, yay, mass migration. People are coming to a new country. It's like, hold on. This is a bad situation. Drug gangs on the border, human trafficking. This is all bad. It's very, very bad. The crisis of mass migration, the dead bodies on the border, all of this is bad. It's bad, and it's a result of imperialism. It's a result of the Western capitalist system that has destabilized and impoverished so many countries around the world and funded drug gangs. Okay, that's my issue with the left. My issue with the right is that all the things that the right advocate as solutions to mass migration would make things worse. One thing that the right says, they say, we'll build a giant wall on the border. Oh, you'll build a giant wall. Okay. Well, if you build a giant wall, that's not going to stop people from coming, number one. And number two, that's only going to enhance the people that smuggle people across, right? Because at this point, there's a whole apparatus of people being smuggled across the border with fraudulent papers, bribing officials, and there's a whole criminal apparatus of smuggling people in the United States. Well, the harder you make it for people to jump over a fence, the more people are going to rely on human trafficking organizations and smuggling organizations. Another thing that people say about immigrants is that immigrants drive down the wages of domestic labor. That's true. But so what is their solution? They say terrorize the immigrant communities, right? Make the immigrant communities afraid, have raids, kick down people's doors. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to make the immigrant communities more afraid to call the police, more afraid to cooperate with law enforcement against the criminal gangs. It's also going to make workers, immigrant workers, more afraid to speak up because did you know it is illegal to pay an undocumented worker less than minimum wage? Did you know that? It is illegal. In the United States, it does not matter whether you have papers or not papers. If you pay an employee, if you're a business in the United States and you pay an employee less than minimum wage, that's a crime. But the reason that undocumented labor doesn't get paid minimum wage is because undocumented immigrants don't speak up and demand that they get paid minimum wage because they're afraid of being deported. So if you terrorize the immigrant communities and you make immigrants more afraid to speak up, and then they're going to get away with paying them even less. Right? And that all the problems that conservatives point to as a result of mass migration, which are very real, which the left doesn't acknowledge. And that's my issue with the left, is they act like mass migration is fine. It ain't fine. However, all the issues that conservatives raise, the lower wages, the driving down of wages, the criminal gangs, the cartels, the human trafficking, all of that gets worse if you do what the right wing wants to do. If you build big giant walls, if you terrorize immigrant communities, if you separate children from their families, if you make immigrant communities afraid of raids on their neighborhoods, all of that just strengthens the criminal organizations, strengthens the cartels, strengthens the ability of the employers to exploit the immigrant workers and pay them less. All the stuff that conservatives advocate doing about the crisis of mass migration makes the very issues that they are concerned about worse. It drives immigrant workers into the shadows. It emboldens criminal organizations. It makes immigrant communities afraid to cooperate with law enforcement. It makes it harder to just walk across the border. It makes people more reliant on the human trafficking organizations. All the things that Republicans want to do make the issue of mass migration worse. What we need is economic development. That's the answer. The United States needs to team up with China and Nicaragua, and they need to create an economic corridor in Central America. Okay, and we have talked about this before in CPI, but we'd like to formally put forward a paper. We need to create an economic corridor of development, kind of like the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the CPEC that China has been doing, with Pakistan. We need their economic corridor of development from the United States down to Nicaragua. There needs to be infrastructure created. There needs to be education. There needs to be an economic corridor of development to bring stability to Central America, right? And we need there to be some kind of agreement between the United States government, the Mexican government, the Nicaraguan government, El Salvador. I love the president of El Salvador, right? Bukele, the Bitcoin guy. He's bringing economic development. He's great. I like the president of Mexico. He actually was reluctant to recognize Joe Biden. He thought that the U.S. election was likely stolen from Trump. AMLO, he's great. And that we need a government, and I love Nicaragua and the socialist government, Ortega in Nicaragua. What we need is there to be an agreement between the Mexican government, the Nicaraguan government, the El Salvador government, and the American government to stabilize that region with economic development and to to fight against the drug cartels, not against people, not against civilians, but against the cartels. The drug cartels, the vicious drug cartels, the human trafficking organizations, they have to be smashed. But the way to smash them is to get rid of the fertile ground where they recruit, which is poverty, right? You have to fight against poverty, right? We need economic development. We need an economic corridor in Central America. And I think China would be a great partner in working with us on that. That's what we need. And that's not, again, it's not a quick fix solution. It's not exciting, right? You want some exciting, and then the superhero cops go down there and no. I'm telling you that the way you fight drug gangs and the way you fight terrorism is with development, with jobs, right? China has stabilized the Uyghur regions and stabilized Tibet, where they had all kinds of separatist violence, with jobs. They brought people education, they brought people healthcare, they gave people jobs and economic opportunities, and now there's not separatist violence in those regions. You're right. Ding, ding, ding. It's economics. The solution to most of the problems in the world that we have right now is economic development, right? If you give people jobs, if you give people economic opportunity, you give people the ability to feed their family and stuff, you generally resolve these kind of problems. So, that's where I stand on mass migration. It's a nuanced position, right? I am not in favor of the left and their glorification and their denial that there's a problem, because there is a problem. There's a huge problem. The fact that millions of people, not just are coming to the United States, Europe has a big issue with people fleeing to Europe from North Africa, from the Middle East. This is bad. It's very, very bad. The crisis of mass migration is very, very bad. The left denies it. So I'm not with the left on this. But I'm not with the right either, because the right, they generally just put forward this kind of xenophobic, oh, these are a bunch of smelly, dirty foreigners, I don't like them. They put that forward. That's not helpful, right? And they advocate building a police state. And the police state is not a solution, right? A police state is not going to make things better. The right doesn't want to face that the real solution here is economic development. So I am in favor of economic development as the solution to stopping mass migration. The crisis of mass migration should end. Should people be able to move to a different country if they feel like it? Sure. But there shouldn't be economic compelled mass migration. We shouldn't have a crisis where people are fleeing on the border. That needs to end. And I think that can be understood, right? We can say that, we don't need to be afraid of people from different cultures, people who speak a different language, but we can acknowledge that the fact that millions of people can't live in their home countries and are risking their lives and dying trying to get places, they're running from something. They're not running towards something, right? They're running away from something. They're running away from extreme poverty, from drug cartels, from conditions that are very bad, and those conditions need to be alleviated. And those conditions are a result of imperialism, of the Western imperialist financial system, of the World Economic Forum, of the monopolistic global capitalism that is destroying countries. Part of the way the left talks about this is they'll say, well, it's America's fault. Well, it's not America's fault. I didn't do it. You didn't do it. The international bankers did it. Wall Street did it. And just saying that it's a result of U.S. foreign policy isn't an answer either, right? And that's one thing people on the right have pointed out, right? That for the longest time, we just say, oh, well, they're coming here because American imperialism is so bad. That's true, but what do we do about it, right? So the left is weak on the issue of mass migration because they're too busy being politically correct, and they're working for the Democrats that don't see it as an issue. Have you seen Candace Owens' video on the Putin interview? Other than her maddening ignorance of Marxism, she tells the truth on the CIA. Candace Owens getting fired from Daily Wire is a good development, and I'm following it. Look, hey, if Candace Owens ever wanted to come on this channel, I'd say yes in a heartbeat. I think the Candace Owens layer of the right that is emerging is very good, right? There's a divide on the right, and Candace Owens represents a good development. Pay attention. There's interesting things happening here. Zionism is a divisive question. imperialism and war. Candace Owens is moving in a good direction. Now, is she necessarily going to keep moving in that direction forever? Who knows? But I like what's happening, right? And I mean, and we have to pay attention to this. And people that want to just say, oh, they're all on the right, they're all bad. Pay attention to these things. Pay attention to these things. Don't render yourself irrelevant by just screaming into the void. You got to pay attention to these things. Candace Owens, what's going on there is very good. The fact that she interviewed Norman Finkelstein, the stuff she's saying about Russia, this is all very, very good. The fact that there's a layer of conservatives who agree with her, and the fact that the Zionist right wing hates her, this is all a good development, right? Tucker Carlson just interviewed the African People's Socialist Party. I mean, we at CPI had a lot to do with making that happen because of Tara Reid and some other things, and we're very proud of that. But the left abandoned the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party. All right, the U.S. government's going after them, but Tucker Carlson supports them and gave them a platform, right? That's a really, really good development. There are contradictions in U.S. society. This isn't the same political terrain that we've always lived in. And if you abstain from these contradictions, and if you just declare you're above them, you're not doing your job. We need to make use of all divisions. We need to insert ourselves into all the contradictions of society. Tucker Carlson interviewing the Uhuru movement and interviewing Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is all good. This is very, very good and important. So I guess that's my response to that. But yeah. So on that note, folks, my voice is dying out. We're a little bit past 2 hours, but it's been fun, and I'll be back. And thank you for the super chats that got me talking. I'll be back. If I'm not back tomorrow night, I'll be back soon afterwards. I'll probably be back tomorrow night. Why not? I like to stream. I like to be on here and stuff. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I'm going to put on the closing music, but I'll be back.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.